Well, hi, everyone. My name is Theresa Wrangham. I am your moderator today for the US Autism Association. And during today's session, we're going to be talking about project-based learning and how it's a unique opportunity for deep engagement and interest-driven projects for children with ASD, particularly during this time with COVID. Our speaker today is Marlo Payne Thurman, and she is also the chairwoman and president for US Autism Association. Marlo started out as a school psychologist, and she works with twice exceptional children as well as individuals who suffer from severe autism. She opened her private practice in 1994, in which she provided assessments and advocacy on a special education consultation basis and often spoke to the sensory needs of individuals. In 1999, she expanded into her own private school, Berdune for Exceptional Children, which was a play-based therapeutic day school that served over 150 children on the spectrum. And when I say spectrum, I mean a huge spectrum. She also created 2E consulting services. She sits on numerous advisory panels and is a faculty member at the University of Northern Colorado, where she teaches pre-service and continuing educators in the graduate school's autism certification program. She's been featured in many magazines such as People Magazine, Special Educator, Attitude Magazine, and the New York Times. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce you to Marlo Payne Thurman. Thanks for being here, Marlo.
Hi, Theresa. How are you? Thanks for doing the moderation for us. I appreciate it.
A pleasure to continue to be in this role. I think I mentioned I'm also on the advisory board for our viewers. So Marlo and I have known each other for a lot of years. So what we're first going to talk about, I think, Marlo, is why don't you define for the viewers exactly what do you mean by project-based learning, and how are you looking at that application right now?
Well, there's a lot of different definitions, but mine is kind of unique in that I really believe that you can teach reading, writing, math, science, social studies, and humanities within some kind of an interest or passion-driven project. And it takes a little work to put that together, but this is where sometimes we can kind of flip curriculum and really integrate that for kids. And when we are really talking about project, we're talking about that rather than just having a paper or some kind of a worksheet or some kind of a thing that the kids are doing in pencil paper, that they're actually building something as part of this project. So I've always said that projects should have an oral, a written, and like a project, an actual tangible object project. So that's my definition of project-based learning.
It sounds really visual. Would you say in your experience that a lot of our kids on the spectrum really benefit from that hands-on visual learning kind of model?
Well, I think it's visual for sure. And yes, we have so many of our kids that really are visual learners and they really need that. But I also think, you talked about in my bio that sensory piece really comes in, because what happens is when you're actually engaged in something that is play-based and it's physical and you're using your hands and you're using your eyes, then you're actually building off of your sensory needs as well. And so I think for kids with autism spectrum, while the visual is an important component, maybe the bigger need is meeting all the sensory needs, where we're not necessarily doing that sitting in a little chair looking at a computer screen.
That just reminds me so much of another aspect of how we try to create overall health in our kids. For children who have those biomedical issues, the approach is much the same. Once you address the medical side, they're better able to pay attention in class and learn those, get through those developmental milestones. And you're talking really about the other side of that with sensory and so on is, once you can calm their sensory system enough, then they can pay attention and develop along those same lines educationally. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And then another, I think, key element of project-based learning is this idea that you're building off of an interest. You're building off of something that is a passion. And one of the things I think I'm starting to understand with people on the spectrum, based on some of my research and some of the conversations I've had, is that unlike neurotypical people do best when they learn and they can tie things to things they know. but they can also generalize and jump out of context. In other words, they can take some brand new thing that they don't have any frame for and do something with it. And I have so many people on the autism spectrum saying, if it's brand new and I don't have a framework for it, I don't have a starting place. And so project-based learning gives that starting place by starting from an interest or an area that a child already knows quite a bit about.
You know, our viewers may not know, but I'm actually the mother to a 30-year-old woman on the spectrum. And as a parent, one of the things I learned early on when I felt so overwhelmed was as I watched for my daughter's strengths and tried to figure out how could I naturalize that into something else. So along those lines, you know, that's kind of what I hear you saying. At a time when we're dealing with COVID and parents may be homebound with their children for, you know, much longer periods of time, they may not have access to an ABA provider or speech path. You know, what are some of the maybe hands-on nuts and bolts? What could they look for? How would you ask them to maybe just take a breath? What do I know about my child, and how would I develop something that could be project-based?
Well, and I think we have to go backwards one step, because it's realizing that this is very special time. In other words, time is valuable, and you know, your kids are grown, my kids are grown. When you're in it, it doesn't feel like it's precious time sometimes.
Yeah,
it feels
sure.
kind of not very precious. But
yeah, I'm saying now, where did 30 years go? But you're absolutely right.
So this idea that if I'm going to be home anyway, and I have to kind of work with my kid on education, and I'm now in the role of maybe the educator, does it make sense for me to sit with my child and look over their shoulder while they're maybe very minimally engaged with a classroom in an online kind of situation and not getting anything out of that? And this is what I'm hearing in my practice, is these parents are just tearing their hair out saying it's just such a waste of time. There's just like, my child's not engaged, they're not getting anything, I'm doing some of the work for them, but nothing's really, that time is being very much wasted. And so when we think about this as maybe precious time, if you've got to take the time anyway and be home and be the educator for your child, then maybe this is a time to actually really think about some of these other skills that you could be developing. And so this is where project-based learning has a role within that. So now to kind of get back to what you were saying, it's this idea that we could actually take that time and get away from the computer and take an interest, take an area of passion, take an area of need, and really dig into that with some really fun, tangible, play-based, interactive things. So rather than sitting and doing these little things online, that maybe we could flip that and actually use that time in a better way, where we're really engaging with our kids in some things that we might not ever have time to do again.
Oh, I think that's hugely valuable. I think it's problematic to ask a teacher to try to teach children online. We know how hard it is. I've often heard you talk about front loading the classroom, that whatever we put in place for our special ed kids that have been generalized into the general ed population, that it helps everyone. And yet when you're on the screen, that's even harder for a teacher to manage. So it may be better to take the reins and say, how do I bring my child along and keep them engaged? Are there maybe some core rules to remember? I hate to use the word rules, but are there things that if a parent chooses to take those reins and try to build in more productivity and create like this sort of system, are there concepts, pillars that they should say, okay, for this to really work, these are the 3 things I have to remember as I pursue this? Is there a guidance on that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple different ones. The first one is, I think, you know, all states have academic standards. So we can go to the State Office of Education and we can look and say, okay, what are the kind of 2nd or 4th or 6th grade academic standards, and how can I meet those? Because we don't want them to just do this cool project and then really be behind in everything else. So
Sure.
Figuring out a way to tie it to the academic standards. And then once we've done that, then I think my rules for project-based learning is every project must be seen, heard, and experienced and must have an oral, a written, and a tangible object project, like I said before. So it's this idea that you're taking something that is already a core standard, you can develop any theme. So you can pick a theme, you know, if your child's into fans or ducks or whatever they're into, you can tie that to curriculum. Your teachers maybe can help with that. But this idea that you can take those academic standards and embed them within some kind of a systematic project that then is very much play-based and hands-on, and really have the kids have some standards around that. The George Lucas Foundation, Project-Based Learning, has a Project-Based Learning Foundation that has some really good content and really good resources for parents if they're interested in kind of doing that. So it's not like you're inventing the wheel. There's a lot of good online resources for project-based learning if you start searching for that. But I always say the best rule is to start with your kids. Start with, okay, what do they really want to do? They've got maybe 2 or 3 months here. What is it that they would always wanted to learn about but never had the time?
Sure. And where else can you shoot that?
Right.
That you were mentioning, did you say Lucas Foundation?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm wondering if will there be maybe some resource links attached to what we're doing right now, that because I think it's overwhelming for parents to have to create this, and you just mentioned what sounds like a great resource.
Right. And I can also talk a little bit about kind of how I build a project, and that might be helpful too, because I think there's, you know, it's like once you've seen one play out, and then it's like, oh, that's not that hard. I get it now.
Right.
Whereas kind of this nebulous, can't wrap my fingers around it kind of project. So yeah.
Actually, that was going to be my next question, because I had the privilege of watching Verdun School start up, and knowing some of the students who went there. And I wonder if you want to just take a real life example of one of the students where perhaps, you know, maybe they were a harder to engage student, but you were aware of a passion they had. How did you channel that passion into learning to those outcomes of oral, tangible, and I can't remember the third, but you know, walk us through that, because I think that's exciting for a parent to hear about in a really real life way.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of examples I had kind of in my mind was a kid that really just loved paper folding, origami stuff. You know what I mean? That was kind of the only thing he wanted to do, was actually origami paper folding type stuff. And so one of the things we did is we had some Chinese exchange students, and we had them come in, and we built this whole Chinese history theme, and it had a period piece where it was like what's going on in the world when origami was created, and what are the mathematical proportions of a piece of paper when you cut it in half and cut it in fourth and fold it in thirds. And so it was understanding mathematically all those, really understanding kind of, you know, and he got into the science of paper, which was different kinds of trees and different kinds of pulps and paper making. And so then getting to the point where he actually, you know, so we're building all these different pieces in, and as we're doing that, he started building paper cranes and started this paper crane project that ended up being, as he's growing up now, he's actually doing art installations with all these paper cranes, and he's got all of these, he's making jewelry out of little paper cranes and little origami figures, and so, and he's donating part of that money back to these trees that he learned about. So it's so, and it's like
that brought up other passions. You were able to get him.
You have a grown man who has literally worked as an artist and made money for himself in the field of origami, and knows everything there is to know about origami, from the history of it to the science of it to the you know what I mean, all the different mathematical, in other words, how big your paper has to be to start before you start folding. So it, like I say, it's pretty interesting, and actually also moved him into some fractal geometry stuff, because that's all those patterns. So it's like I say, we could take that one tiny thing and build this project, and that actually for him became kind of a lifelong passion that he's now, you know, has this little career of where he's making jewelry and doing these art installations in paper fold.
Well, and that's no small thing, because as we've heard Temple Grandin talk about and Stephen Shore, you know, while these academic goals are very important for our children, employment can be hard to find. So it's always good as a parent to keep your eye on the ball on how might this translate into a paycheck. And I'm willing to bet that parent never saw that one coming. But how fantastic that that happened. It's hard to make it in the art world, and yet this gentleman has done that. How wonderful. What a great example. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I'm wondering if paper folding might have started out as a STEM, because I wanted to ask you about STEMs because I know of your expertise in sensory, and we talked about how you have to calm that down to get that attention, that engagement. I'm thinking about a lot of parents at home, how COVID-19 might create more of an environment where our children, you know, nothing is the same. Routines are so different now for them with respect to learning. You know, are you hearing in your practice more reports of issues with STEMs? And I like your take on STEMs. So I was wondering if you could share that and maybe share whatever it is you're hearing in your practice around that and give some advice.
Yeah, I think STEMs always were the things we do with our bodies to keep us engaged. We all have STEMs. We all have things that we do to, you know, I play with my hair a little bit. I'm sitting here tapping my foot. But some of these STEMs are complex motor movements, and they actually serve some kind of an organizational process in the brain. And it's interesting, when I work with some of my non-vocal kids, they talk about how the STEMs also are a way for them to interact with the world and sometimes even communicate with the world. I have one client that I worked with through the years who is actually now grown and on our advisory board. So I know he would be okay with me telling this story, that he talks about stimming during different periods of his life. He used it almost like echolocation. So he would, based on how he would flap and off of the flap, that would almost, you know, he talks about, it was like he was using it, like, yeah, some echolocation. He also interestingly talks about STEMs from the standpoint of it's how we with autism communicate with each other when we can't communicate, which I thought was really fascinating.
Oh, wow. Like a sign language.
Yeah, it's almost like, how severe are you and what's going on with you? And it's like there's some understanding and communication that is STEM. So there's lots of different reasons for STEMs. And I think what we're doing for any of us is we're feeding our sensory system. And so I think a STEM serves the purpose of feeding the sensory system. And when we're in a position where we're locked to a chair, especially behind a computer screen, it's worse even than it was in a regular classroom. So in a classroom is bad enough to be locked in a chair and have the teacher moving around and the kids also locked in their chairs. But now it's even worse because you have to be, and by the way, those of us who are on Zoom know it's actually a lot more work to attend to somebody on a video screen than it is to attend to them in person. And I'm not sure that all the cognitive logistics of that, but it's, so in other words, the sensory system is starving by online learning. And it's true for many of us, actually. And so this is why we said, and by the way, many of us are more aware of our STEMs now that we're doing online Zoom meetings or whatever, because we're literally kind of couch locked to this screen, right? So like I say, I think this idea that all of us are feeding our sensory system, but for kids on the spectrum, that need is greater, and the need to feed the sensory system is greater. So these kids, they're not functioning well to sit and look at a computer screen. And I think it's actually very hard. Some of the kids I've heard from, it's actually hard for them to process the visual information on a computer screen. In other words, depending on what the background is, depending on the lighting, depending on, you know, like in your kitchen, I see this kind of tile pattern, maybe harder than ever to focus on you, the teacher, if you were the teacher in this situation, because of the pattern in your kitchen tile. Does that make sense?
Too busy, too much input.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and just input that takes extra work to register. And by the way, you can say it's too much, or you can say it's not enough, but it's
right.
different, right? It's the input, the way, to the point that some of our individuals with autism have literally talked about as adults that they believe they have a really different visual processing module. Like, I actually see the world differently, and I don't see face extracted from the background. Background and face kind of blend together for me. I don't see eyes extracted from the face. The whole face kind of appears as an image. So it's possible that some of our kids with autism, at least, are literally processing visual information differently. And so that screen is adding a new layer of visual information processing that may be a problem.
You know, I hadn't heard that, but just as a an experience with my daughter that I bet a lot of parents listening have had. One of the things my daughter used to do when she hit middle school, that she hadn't done in grade school, she started talking to herself down the hallways. Mm-hmm. And of course, to her peers, that seemed odd. And somebody asked me about it, and I actually asked my daughter, and from what she could piece together and what I could piece together from the feedback I was getting, it was a jamming signal. She doesn't have the ability to like attend to you if you're talking to her and not hear the TV or the radio. They all sound the same volume, which is very much what we hear from people with hearing aids, is that everything's louder, there's no filtering. So I kind of think of it as, at least my daughter's auditory system doesn't have the ability to give one priority over the other. It's all the same volume. So by sending out a jamming signal, it helped calm her sensory system down. She didn't have to process the 30,000 conversations that were going on as she went down the hall to get her books out of her locker. And I hadn't thought about that in a visual aspect, that maybe they're processing visually differently, but I know they process light differently. They can see the flicker on the screens and stuff differently.
Right. And by the way, yeah, you're right. So it's visual, it's auditory, it's all of those things. In the auditory arena, I think one of the things we're really seeing, and this is even true for my pretty high functioning kids, my kids who've done really well in school until now, and the parents are like, I don't understand what's going on. And what we're finding is that so many of these kids, in fact, and it's interesting because I've never seen any good research on it, but I have yet to see a kid on the spectrum that's diagnosed accurately to be on the spectrum that doesn't have auditory discrimination issues, meaning that they hear everything and can't prioritize or discriminate. I have yet to find one. There might be one, but I have yet to find one. So when you think about that, what's happening in an online learning environment, they're so dependent on exactly what they see and what they hear. They can't use the cues of anything else in the room. And so my kids who have done well in the classroom until now are falling apart like in massive numbers and not passing classes, even though they've done really well, because what's happening is they can't get enough information off of the screen to function and know what they're supposed to be doing. And they believe they know what they're supposed to be doing. So they go ahead and do the work and it's not right, or they've done something wrong, or they've left something out, or they've done the wrong set of problems. And it's because they don't have the other kids to cue off of. Does that make sense?
That's what I was going to ask. You're talking about social cueing. Rachel went undiagnosed for a really long time because she could watch her peers and mimic. She was great at mimicking. So it was covered up for a really long time, except for her language. So so now you're talking about they're just seeing a teacher. They have no other cue to go off of. So they really are bereft of trying to look around and say, what's Susie doing over there?
Exactly. And by the way, what we find is that many of the kids were heavily reliant. Like they didn't ever hear what was going on. They just kind of like modeled or looked over the shoulder or saw what somebody else is doing and then used their intelligence to kind of figure out what they were supposed to be doing. And now they don't have that.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm wondering what you think about, I've heard various schools of thought on stemming. And I've heard some thoughts around you have to get them to stop stemming. And to me, it sounds like it's almost like it's a coping mechanism. And are we really just talking about, it seems to me it may not be a good idea to stop it so much as if it's a really distracting stem, maybe find a good substitute that because we all stem, as you pointed out, we shake our foot, we tap our pencils, and those aren't as irritating as maybe the child who has to bang on the desk. What are your thoughts around that?
Well, and again, we're talking about, if we're talking about online, it's even harder, right? Because the teacher's got all these little bobbing heads, right, on the screen. So from a teacher's perspective, it's actually even harder than ever to be on the opposite side of a group of 30 little bobbing heads, right? So if they've got this kind of stuff going on, makes it even harder. One of the things I always have taught my kids is you can do anything you want to do. And I almost like that it's the combination of fidgeting, stemming, you can actually put those on a continuum, right? And by the way, I think some stems, there's just not a breaking them because they are serving such a solid purpose that you have to figure out what the purpose is. And until you solve the purpose, you're not going to solve the stem.
I see. So figure the purpose first.
Yeah, purpose first. But for the STEMs that are more in the realm of kind of fidgety, restless kind of stuff, I think in those cases, it's helpful to, like you say, kind of shape those or model those. I have the fidget box, right? It has to be below your chin, between your shoulders, and above your knees. And it's a box. And you can do anything you want in that box, fidget-wise. Well, it's socially appropriate. But yeah, within this little box, you can play with paper clips, you can flip a rubber band, you can fold paper, you can flap your hand a little bit, there's a lot of things you can do. And that's not as visible as if you're up here or out here or up here, because you're not in other people's visual space. You're in your own box. Does that make sense? So that can be helpful. But again, I don't think you could ever really talk about STEMs without talking about the need they're serving. And so in that respect, it's not something that I ever start with the STEM. I always start with the need of what is going on? Why are they STEMing? And sometimes they're STEMing just to block us out. I mean, truly, it's the way to get rid of us, right?
Yeah, well, I suppose.
And that's okay. Maybe we need to go away and come up with some other ways to approach. In other words, what we're trying to shove into their space is not tolerable to them for some reason. And this is where, again, coming back to project-based learning, is this idea that if we're coming off of something that interests them, and by the way, all of our stuff in autism is like, join the child, get on their level, figure out what their interests are, figure out what their strengths are. This is just another way to take education and learning and tie it together. So in some ways, it's bringing their interest to them, and then it's also taking all of the things that you need to teach them and figuring out how to kind of anchor that to this theme that you've got going, that is something that they're interested in, as opposed to, we're going to do this and now you can't, now we're going to go over here and do this and now we're going to do this, because that disconnectedness of education is really hard for our kids with autism on the spectrum. It's helpful. This is why I think project-based learning is such a strong model, is because it integrates all of how things fit together, the relatedness of things. And I think that's really important for kids on the spectrum. Neurotypical kids, I think, do a better job of generalizing across sets, whereas kids with autism have a hard time making those generalizations. So we're building bigger wholes. Does that make sense? Bigger constructs.
Right. And what you're saying is, I mean, as we all know, with autism, one of the key deficits is the inability to generalize across environments. And what I hear you saying is, take their passion, harness it, figure out how you can work mathematics and fractal geometry and all this other stuff in it, right? But it also, you're saying that this will really help them generalize across environments, because it's a richer opportunity. Is that kind of
what you're doing? If you think about it, it's almost like, I had this explained to me, so this isn't even from me, this is from somebody on the spectrum. They're saying, what he was explaining is that neurotypical people tend to generalize this way, right? In other words, it's like they can jump sets. Like, I can take a set, I can think about this concept of, I think Temple Grandin talked about the concept of church steeples, right? And I can generalize across all church steeples to the point that I have one common image and set and experience that I tie to all of my constructs about church steeples. Whereas individuals on the autism spectrum, because they're focusing on difference, the anomaly, the oddity, they're remembering every difference about every church steeple, right? So in other words, what we're doing with project-based learning then is we're building this large set of churches and the history of churches, so in other words, we're tying more information to that one construct that they have of that church steeple. And they might have another one that's completely different, but that would have a whole new set to it, so that eventually they have filled in all the gaps. And so rather than thinking this way, we're building these kinds of things, and then so that they can bridge across them eventually.
You're connecting the dots. You're okay. Got it.
Yeah.
Is there I'm just wondering, I know we're talking about project-based learning in terms of hybrid learning that can be taken on during what is an exceptional time for us as human beings on the planet, really. But do you think there's an opportunity for maybe educators to take this into the classroom once all this is over? Because I know that was, part of your concept in Verdun was that all kids can benefit from this in some way, shape, or form. are you working with any teachers to maybe help support parents in this? Or I'm just curious about what kind of feedback you might be getting from professionals and where you see it going with educators. Is this something we'll see more of in a classroom, do you think?
I really think we need to. I think we're starting to see it in Tinker Mills, in our little STEM enrichment stuff. In other words, in these kind of more hands-on project things that we're doing like on Friday afternoon, right? I think the catch is that as long as, and by the way, it's tricky. Teachers have a really, really, really difficult job because they have to design this curriculum for all these kids. They have to track all the progress. Everything has to be supposedly individualized and tailored to the needs of the child. And that is just literally not feasible from the standpoint of a single teacher in a single classroom, given the broad number of needs within that classroom. So I think and you probably know this, but our viewers don't, I really believe that we have to really get very serious about revolutionizing education towards this kind of a model for all kids anyway. So in other words, but it takes us out of these really classical sit in a desk brick and mortar spaces. In other words, it's a big job because we have to rethink our spaces. We have to rethink different differentiation of curriculum. We have to think measurement of standards. We have to think about how we're gonna track progress. And we've been in a period for about the last, I don't know, since about 2004 with the No Child Left Behind Act, that it's really assessment driven. In other words, everything is based on tangible data and assessment driven concepts. And there's nothing wrong with assessment driven, but the problem with assessment driven for educators is that now that's their job. You can't do both. You can't develop rich project-based learning at the same time that you're tracking individual academic standards for every single child. And so so in order to make this work at a systems-based level, you'd have to be in a position where the tracking of standards was actually done through technology or software, which is possible. And by the way, we do this all the time in, high-level video games. So in other words, high-level video games can keep track of millions of players and know exactly what level they are and exactly what level they've done and what path they've been down and what thing they've mastered.
Their proficiency is, yeah.
So in other words, it's being able to combine something like that such that the teachers are then free to actually go back to teaching and building tangible hands-on projects. Does that make sense? So in other words, so part of your curriculum is still this really tracked, documented, evaluated standards and steps and all of that. But the other part of it is then coming out of that and being able to generalize that learning into some really real world, play-based, project-based kind of models. Does that make sense? And that's where it's tricky because yes, you can take pieces of it, but it's hard to take pieces of it within the construct because our construct is so assessment driven that there's no time for something like this in the classroom because if I do this, then I don't know that I'm going to get my math standard in. I don't know that I'm going to get my reading standard in for those individual kids that we're trying to track all that data on. Does that make sense?
It does, but I'm wondering if we could learn from, again, I'm going to draw as a parent on my own personal experience, but one of the things I knew about my daughter early on is she was a visual learner and her language was disappearing. And so we were living overseas, came back home to get her diagnosed. And in the meantime, because I knew her strength was visual learning and we had her in a Montessori program, and just for viewers who don't understand the difference between Montessori overseas and Montessori here in the United States, you want to make sure you have a certified Montessori school here in the States because it's in the public domain. You don't have to be fully developed as a Montessori school. Anyway, Montessori was a very rich visual curriculum that was very project-based. You worked with your hands. So for Rachel, that meant she could self-correct and so on. And yet, when we got to Colorado, Rachel was enrolled into a focus school that was Montessori. I will say Montessori doesn't marry well as a focus school to the academic curriculum that we have in the state of Colorado in terms of academic standards, but they found a way. And I'm wondering if like Waldorf and Montessori, who I believe at least in Maria Montessori's works, you can see that she was dealing with people on the spectrum. She was dealing with what was considered uneducable people. And yet she created a system of exactly what you're talking about, to some extent project-based, and was able to hit standards, and they still are hitting standards. So I'm wondering, instead of recreating the wheel, if standardized education, the brick and mortar K through 12 could look at other methods of multi-age classrooms so that you actually have an aide with you. When we staffed our daughter, it was a fight between the Montessori focus school and a traditional school. The traditional teachers were amazed at how supportive and self-correcting the Montessori system was. It was clear that was the better fit. So are there opportunities to learn within existing structures that would help revolutionize our classrooms without losing, but just picking up, not recreating the wheel? Maybe it's already there to an extent. That's what I'm throwing out based on what you're saying.
Well, and what you're really talking about is this idea that we've somehow in the last 15 years or so got into the idea that if we teach all the little pieces, regardless of whether they're connected or not, if we make sure that each kid has measured that they have proved that they can do all these little pieces, that's going to come together in terms of a comprehensive whole in a meaningful way. And that is the theory that we're working on, and that is the standards that we're measuring, and that is the evaluation procedures that we're putting in place, okay? But the catch-22 is, and anybody who's teaching at the university will tell you, is our kids are actually less prepared at the college level than they were 15 years ago, because they don't know how to function outside of those little concrete pieces. They don't know how to create anymore. Right. They don't know how to create these systematic wholes for themselves. And that's actually, so there may be some benefit to those little tiny pieces for some types of kids, but for kids on the spectrum, because they don't get any real tangible learning until it ties to something that's meaningful to them, then all of these disconnected pieces are just dropped off. Our kids are having a hard time holding all these disconnected pieces. Other kids are holding them in their executive functioning and their memory system, but that's where our kids have less ability in terms of executive functioning and kind of that short term. They have excellent long-term memory. When they've got it, but those little short-term memory pieces don't stick. And so this is where we kind of maybe are hounding and pounding on these little tiny pieces to get the measurable objective and the evaluation of that measurable objective. And it's almost like we have to really reframe back to what is learning. And by the way, what is learning supposed to be? It's supposed to be training children to be functioning adults, right?
To be successful once they leave school, to be able to function in society.
Right. Yeah. And so this idea that if you've memorized all these little facts and you've memorized all these little details and you can do these little stepwise things, that might not necessarily apply to being an adult.
Right.
And that's a hard thing for a lot of people to think about, because education, we're so indoctrinated into the education is this thing that we're all trying to achieve. But it's almost like, to revolutionize education, we have to actually come back and say, okay, what is it that we want for our children? And let's be clear, for our kids on the autism spectrum, we want them to be able to have something that they can do for enjoyment that actually makes them a living at some point in the future. That would be ideal, right?
Well, I have a neurotypical child and I have a child on the spectrum, and I would say that's what you want for both that's what you want for all kids. It may be a more challenging task to achieve with our children on the spectrum, because they have trouble doing this. As you said, they have trouble generalizing. It sounds like what you're also saying is education is making it harder for typical kids to generalize, because we're teaching pieces, parts. And I know that's a criticism Montessori method would have about how we teach now, is we teach in a linear fashion, that at age whatever, in 4th grade, you have to learn this. And Montessori has a 3-year breakout, saying learning happens in 3-year spurts. So one kid might get it at that beginning, but the other kid may not get it until the end of that 3 years. But generally speaking, somewhere in that 3 years, they'll get that. And so it's more flexible and geared to meet the child where they're at. And I've read the same studies you're talking about, where our kids are less able to function and less prepared for college, even though we have all these assessments. They aren't meeting college standards. My typical child, there were standards that she didn't meet, and she had a mix of education. She had some of those tangibles, and yet we seem to be falling short. We may have bigger challenges with our spectrum children, but it seems like what you're talking about would have benefit not only for children on the autism spectrum. We're all on that same spectrum, aren't we? And you're just talking about the canaries in the coal mine where they show up more readily. We can see something's processing differently, but we all are on that spectrum somewhere, aren't we?
Yeah, and I think it's also helpful to understand that I believe, and by the way, there's people that probably argue with me, but I believe that this is maybe the first time in our human history that what we do in education is not necessarily really preparing children to be adults. And when we think about that, it's because the school products are so non-tangible. They're so extricated from real life experience. Does that make sense? In other words, there's no reason in the world, and we see this, you see like these kids who pull out and just go off on their own tangent, and they make these great contributions as children. And you're like, well, how did they do that? It's because they had the time and permission to do that and the support to do that. But it's not because children can't contribute to the world in meaningful ways as children. In other words, so this is kind of the concept then when you come back all the way into this project-based learning model. It's this idea that your projects are authentic, that they have meaning. They have meaning for the child. They have meaning to the society. And so these kids who are really struggling, in a Black Lives Matter movement, for example, I've got one kid I'm working with right now who's just so mortified by, George Floyd and everything that happened there, that he's having a hard time functioning in other parts of his life. But okay, so then let that kid be an activist. Let that be the project. Build everything into that project. Reading, writing, math, science, social studies, humanities. Build everything into this. Let that kid contribute something meaningful. Let him feel like he's doing something now versus having to wait to grow up and become an adult before he can do anything about these things that are really upsetting to him. Does that make sense?
Oh, totally. I love that idea. Because I think there's a lot going on in the world where our kids feel apathetic. They don't feel like they're being allowed to make a contribution, or, they can't vote yet. They can't do X, Y, and Z. And hey, you're only a kid. And yet there have been moments in history where a child's voice has made a difference, right?
Like you look at Greta. I mean, Greta's a perfect.
That's what I was going to say. Look at Greta.
Here we've got a kid who just is like, why go to school at all? Because you guys are destroying the planet so quickly that I'm not going to have a planet to live in. But get out of school. So what's the point of going to school? But the point is she's learning a whole lot. And like I say, and that's where I'm sure she's having to learn all of the academic subjects within her activism project, because in order to function in the adult world, you have to have a certain level of math and a certain level of reading ability and a certain level of writing ability. You have to understand how governments work together and the history of the world and what got us here. And she's learning those things. She's just learning them in a really non-traditional way. And I would bet if you were to assess her in terms of her standards, literally do a formal assessment on academic standards with her, I'll bet she'd be sky high. And it's not because she was in school.
Yeah. I'm wondering what you think about kind of getting back to the project-based learning and trying to create at least a hybrid of that during COVID. I know one of the things I really worried about with actually both my children, but particularly with my spectrum daughter, screen time. It was one thing to let her have some downtime. That was how she could calm some of her sensory issues. After a very overwhelming day, she could go watch a movie of her choice. Or there were some funny YouTubes that, she could watch repetitively, laugh, and it just kind of got her calm and in a different space. So now we're asking our kids to sit in front of a screen, like you've already said, and we've talked about maybe what some of those shortcomings are, some of the auditory stuff that it's pretty well documented for our kids, but now we're talking about some visual as well. What about just now we're glued to a screen? This used to rescue some of our kids, but it was also a deficit in that our kids have trouble with socialization. And I'm watching our kids in general mistake Facebook friends for friendship. That's not a friend. That's a computer connection acquaintance. That may be a friend, but friendship is really more of a tangible thing. Now we're not allowed to go out and see people as regularly as once we did. There's restrictions on that, and we have people in front of the screen. Isn't there a need for some project-based learning, even just based on that level, getting people out of the screen and using their hands and engaging their brains differently? Because this is a nice piece of technology that we can do this, but I would much rather be in the room with you talking. I would much rather be in a conference room feeding off our audience. This is a very difficult thing to do just between you and I.
Well, and by the way, anybody who's doing this knows that this is, like we said before, it's very exhausting to sit on the screen, even as adults who do it for a day job. I mean, I know I'm doing a lot more teleconsulting type stuff, and at the end of the day, I am, way more wiped out. I'm literally not functioning very well on certain days, and it's the same number of clients that I saw in my office, but by the time I'm done with that on screen, it's just not feasible. So it's recognizing that there's something uniquely problematic about a screen in terms of its energy demands on us, and really now amplifying that 5 or 10-fold for a kid on the spectrum. And yes, maybe our kids can't go out and run around the neighborhood or play with other kids, but we actually have a relationship with them. And this is where, I guess, coming all the way back around and saying, okay, when do you get 3 months with your kid to actually do something that they're interested in instead of school for a minute? Maybe this is the time that parents say, okay, my relationship with my child and this precious time that we have during COVID is a time that I can work on that parent-child dyad. I can work on relationships. We can talk about things that we never get time to talk about. I can teach them how to make bread. Does that make sense? Teach them living skills.
You're bonding with your child outside of educating. You're talking about actually what a precious time to have an additional layer added to your relationship.
But it is education too. And that's the thing. Right. That's the thing that I think is helpful. So, teach them to make bread, but throw some math in there, make them read the recipe, make them actually measure the ingredients, cut the recipe in half and see, okay, we're going to make a third of a batch of bread today because the last batch molded. So it's this whole idea that you're actually, everything we do, we can, especially if you get a little tiny bit familiar, and there's a couple ways to do that. I mean, just go online at your local school district, or, the What Every Child Should Know series, those curriculum series. It's like, get an idea about what most kids are doing at these ages. And I'm kind of talking about young kids. It's a little bit different for teenagers, so remind me to come back to that. But for younger kids, it's really thinking about, okay, this is a time to play with my child and come out of school for a minute, and I can still teach them. I can teach them everything they need to know over baking a loaf of bread. And
it's true. Yeah, we always called it Teachable Moments. Before our daughter was diagnosed, I had read a book, Montessori at Home. And now as I look back at the book, it was, and our life, it was really just looking at every opportunity you have with your child. Why do we assign chores? Well, chores are about how to take care of yourself once you leave home, really. It's preparing your child for how to take care of themselves at home.
Right.
We talk about our children on the spectrum, we call those life skills. What life skills? You can teach those very early on, and with kids on the spectrum, it's very important because they take sometimes longer to learn those skills. So you're talking about, let's look at our lives and use what we know on functioning and using it as a teachable moment in a naturalized sense, right?
And absolutely. And by the way, and let me add a word to that. It's a real life experience teachable moment. In other words, you're teaching them.
I'm not manufacturing it. It's real, it's natural.
Not only that, it's a skill set that, and by the way, that you brought up a really valuable point, because one of the things I think a lot of parents, especially who are new to autism, struggle with is that I have to teach academics at home now, in this case. Hopefully the teachers are doing that part of the time. But I also have to teach all of those soft skills that other kids you don't have to teach. Like you don't have to teach other kids, you know, things like how to take a shower when they're 16, 17, 18 years old. You don't have to make sure they have their shower routine still going forward and that they're still washing appropriately at 16, 17, 18. Right. Whereas on an autistic kid, maybe we're having to do that, teaching them how to cook. Kids, yeah, we kind of, neurotypical parents, I have 2 neurotypical kids, sort of. Actually, that's a huge assumption.
What's normal? What's normal?
Neurotypical, and I don't think I would even say that. But I cooked around my children. My kids kind of helped in the kitchen, and my kids kind of both know how to cook. But for a kid with an autism spectrum disorder, that's a more formal instructional process that's required. And this time, and so that's maybe what I'm saying in a nutshell, is that this time is too valuable to plop your kid in front of a computer. This time is, especially for kids, I would say under 7th, 8th grade, where we're not counting high school credits, right? This is a very, very valuable and precious time to get something else in there, because you're not going to get this time again. And for many of these kids, the sit behind a screen and do this online kind of learning is really just wasted time. And so coming back and thinking about, okay, I'm choosing to not use the time in that way. And by the way, I'm sure there's schools and educators out there that are not going to be terribly happy with what I'm saying. And then there might be ones that are cheering loudly because I'm suggesting that parents actually pull their kid out of that system for a few months and really use this as teachable moment time. But I do think it's valuable time, and I don't think we can afford to lose the time. And I think if I have one big concern, it's that for our kids on the spectrum, this whole COVID thing, they're losing so much time and they're losing so much ground because they're not getting even the minimal amount of learning that other kids are getting out of this online learning model. Some kids can do kind of mediocre learning. I don't think anybody learns well by sitting behind a computer all day. But some kids are getting something out of it. I don't think our kids are getting much at all. And there's a point where you say, okay, is it worth it to stay in the system? Or is it worth it to say, okay, we're opting to do a different kind of homeschooling model. We'll be back when you go back to the classroom. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and what I hear you saying actually is not just for kids on the spectrum. Maybe this is really maybe what COVID has presented us, because I've seen articles where it says, well, parents are unhappy with, and I don't want to like blame teachers for it. I think you've brought out how amazingly difficult it is for teachers to teach in this. It's not that they don't want to teach and they don't want our children to learn, but that this may not be the most effective way of teaching. And yet there isn't a lot of choice on the part of the teacher, but what we do have is parents have a choice because we are home. And maybe what really at the very basic level is, whether you have a child on the spectrum or you have a typical child, neurotypical child, take a moment and ask yourself, is this successful for my child? And if it's not, there's an opportunity, whether your child's on the spectrum or not, to do something along the line of project-based learning. Because there is a lot of concern in our nation right now about kids falling behind, and they're not even talking about our special ed kids so much. They're talking about all children falling behind, that this may be a year or two lost out of this generation in terms of learning. And I think colleges are concerned too. The seniors that just graduated, they had their year truncated. Now we're going into another year of that. What will that mean for the juniors that are now seniors? So maybe it's a good message for all parents and not just children on the spectrum, for parents just to take a breath and say, is there another way for my child to get benefit from education? Does it look different from this? Maybe I should be considering that. I have this golden opportunity that I may not have again. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I think it's even more than that, Theresa. And like I said, it's hard, but I also think it really puts us all in a position, parents and educators alike. And by the way, we got to remember, teachers, some of them don't have any tech background. I mean, literally, you're having to learn how to use
this. They're all like, I don't know, I can't even figure Zoom out.
And it's not, it's just because they didn't, when they went to school, they weren't, the tech wasn't available, so they didn't learn. So Again, it's not a criticism of teachers, and it's not a criticism of the work that goes out there. And I really want to reiterate that, because I'm an educator myself, and it is just so, I mean, these teachers, they are the heroes in terms of trying to make do in a really, really awful situation.
Absolutely.
But I think what's also happening is it's highlighting for both teachers and parents alike this idea, like, what actually is education then? What should we be teaching? And by the way, we have all these standards, but the standards themselves aren't evidence-based necessarily.
Right.
If you think about that, like, there's
I know that. I've done my research. That might be news for some parents, though.
Right. Like we tie everything to, we tie evidence to the standards, but the actual development of the standards themselves is historically created by our academic publishing companies, right? So in other words, what we teach in the American curriculum, or what we teach in the world curriculum, really, what children learn is based on these standards that there was no evidence put in. There was no research, that there was never a team of people that sat down and said, okay, what should children learn to become adults, and create an entire curriculum. So we kind of did that, but we did that so many years ago that we haven't redone that. So in other words, the foundation,
revisit and reassess.
Right, that the curriculum was designed during the period when the needs were, if you think about it, the American curriculum was designed during a period of time when the needs were to get kids in a systematic educational system, like a factory kind of system. And we were working on our factory mentality. But what's happening now is that technology has changed all that. Kids don't need to memorize all these facts anymore, because they can look them up on Google so quickly. It's like, I don't need to remember that Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. That's a 1-second search on Google. And so this idea that maybe actually stand back, I think that's what we're seeing as parents. It's like, what they're doing is such a waste of time. There's so much more valuable things I could be teaching them to become adults, but it's also making us maybe stand back and rethink the entire construct of education from the standpoint of what we should be teaching children for the 21st century to be contributing members to the 21st century.
Yeah, well, I can only agree with that personally. I hope other parents, I think it's a thoughtful question that we can ask ourselves at many points, you know, and I want to circle back around to what you said a few minutes ago. You wanted me to ask you about teenagers. I know for myself, as my daughter grew, going through an IEP meeting was very different, because we had to sort out, okay, we're kind of at the end of the K through 12 career. Where are her skills? You know, she's college bound. This is our last jump through this window to get her through that hoop. You know, what kind of supports will be there and what will not be there, because IDEA is very different from 504. And parents, if you don't know that, understand that when your child goes to college, there's no IDEA, there are no special education plans. They have to be largely independent. So you should be looking at weaning, in my opinion, off of accommodations and seeing where your child is and what is it going to take to get them there. And that looked really different. There were things we decided weren't as important, like maybe some of the math skills versus English skills, or it was really tough to do some picking and choosing and then figuring out where we're going to have to build extra support. So you had said something about, I want to say something about high schoolers or teenagers as they get older. So what are the differences you were talking about before it hits a transcript? What about a high school student, where if you make this decision to do a project-based learning, you know, that becomes a little bit more critical. You're talking about a transcript at this point. What did you want to say about that?
Well, I think there's a couple ways to do it. First of all, I want all parents to understand that there's actually, most parents don't get this, but there's actually 2 tracks to college. Okay, one of them is high school diploma. Actually, there's 3. High school diploma, ACT, SAT score, and you go in the front door. The second track is you kind of don't make it through high school. You do some community college classes. You build a college transcript. Once you've got about 20, 25 credits on a college transcript, through like Front Range, or in our case Front Range, but community colleges or tech schools or vocational schools, then all of a sudden you're transferring as a college transfer student. You're no longer transferring into college as a high school student.
Right.
The third option is that you're actually, as a parent, documenting and building a transcript for your child. People who homeschool do this all the time. And it's saying, okay, here's what we taught, here's the textbook we use, here's the standard, and here's the portfolio of work to demonstrate the child actually has mastered these skills. And that we use that in conjunction with an ACT or SAT score to go through and apply to colleges that way. So when you think about those three different tracks, when we're in this weird COVID, and I've got kids who, the kids who are freshmen or sophomore in high school are in a really different position than the kids who are seniors this year, right? So it's like, for a kid who's a senior this year, yeah, project-based learning is going to sound really, really awesome to them, but it actually may be more work in the long run to spin that around and get that into an alternative track kind of model and get them then still college bound. Whereas a kid who's younger might still have a little bit of time to do some online coursework or take some community college classes to build that alternative track. So it's almost like deciding, but don't jump. I guess, even though I've said that younger parents should just pull the plug and maybe, build Rome in their living room. I'm saying for older kids, it makes sense to kind of keep track of this idea that you have to recover that in some way on a transcript, or you have to kind of sell out on that you're going to graduate from high school in a traditional way. So it's important to kind of have that caveat in there that for older students, there's more to it in terms of making sure that you're not jumping ship, when the kid is like one semester away from graduating from high school and now they end up owing a year as a super senior because they, that's the easiest course to get their high school diploma. So it's important to kind of remember what we're talking about in relationship to that transcript.
That's a really good point. I would also say, I think just from a personal standpoint, our community colleges get short shrift. For our kids on the spectrum, very often, as it was for my daughter, I've talked to other parents, and I know they're in your practice as well. The nice thing about a community college experience for our children on the spectrum, it's a smaller community. It's not as overwhelming. There are different drawbacks. The peer group it's a wider variety of age, and you have a lot of adults who have jobs who are taking one or two courses. So the socialization looks different. But the support is good, the education is good. Even for my typical daughter, many kids who go to those four-year colleges initially, they spend a year finding themselves, and sometimes they drop out and they're trying to figure out what to do. My daughter took her year at community college to refigure what she wanted to do, my typical, and she did exactly what you're talking about. It was cheaper, number one, it articulates, so you're not getting a lesser education, and it just articulated across to CU, and it was not a problem, and it gave both my children the space they needed to grow for very different reasons, and it gave them the education they needed. So community colleges, I think, really fit a lot of bills, regardless of whether or not you're on the spectrum and maybe you need that smaller environment, or you're finding yourself and you're a neurotypical kid.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll add to that I think it's really also important, especially for people that are our age and maybe even 10 years younger than us. And I know that you and I are closer, you and I are closer in age than some people, but in other words, there are people who have kids our age that are younger than us and older than us. But what we were taught in our generation was that in order to be successful, you had to go to college, right? In other words, so it was like everybody had to be college bound. And I would say that it's helpful for parents now of children to understand that the world has changed a lot in the last 25 years, and that some of the most successful kids are the kids who go into the trades and the vocational stuff.
Exactly.
And that was really a second class route in our generation. In other words, the kids who were doing that, it was because they didn't have the skills to go to college, where now that's maybe where better jobs are, better opportunities are. And, I'm also dealing with, this whole population of kids who have a college degree in, American literature or something, and don't have, they're looking at their couch, right? They're couch locked. So let me come back to this idea then that the trade and vocational school actually might be a better route for a lot of these kids. And, I'm the mother of two tradesmen who are very, very successful. My daughter's a tattoo artist. My son is a blacksmith. And I didn't necessarily plan that for them. And they both have, you know, some college. My daughter actually has a college degree, but it's interesting because the world has changed so much that the ability to make a living off of a college degree is not necessarily a given anymore. And so this is where tying one thing back around to kind of our project-based learning is if you can develop an interest and a passion, you might be developing a career. And I remember, like I said, my daughter's world-class tattoo artist. You can check out her stuff. It's astounding. And, you know, $250, $350 an hour shop rate, and owns a gift shop and all this kind of stuff. But the reason that I say that even for her, and she was more neurotypical, kind of quirky, but neurotypical, you know, I remember the teachers saying in 5th grade, can you please send in non-toxic ballpoint pens because she's drawing on all of the other children. And and so this idea, that was something that she had in her head a long, long time ago. And it's something that she herself sensed and knew and was very artistic and had that interest and that abilities. Always loved tattoo. I don't know where it came from. You almost have to believe in past lives or something.
Her drawings are amazing. But what about, what is it, CTE over there on Arapahoe campus, for those of you who live in Colorado? More to your point, in terms of trades, high schools offer, you know, these opportunities for children while they're in high school, while still meeting their academic curriculum, trades. You can learn to be a cosmetologist, a car mechanic, which, hey, today is very different from when, you know, our fathers worked on equipment. It's all very highly technical and computerized now. My daughter learned how to be a graphic artist for like print companies. So what was nice about that, just for parents who don't know that, if your high school has that offering where your child has a trade interest, you could gear them toward that curriculum within a high school arena. And for us, that was college credit. Those credits transferred to the community college level. So my daughter was already ahead in terms of, she already had college credit. It was almost like an AP course for her. They offer those AP courses for our typical children. This is almost like your AP course for your child on the spectrum. If they have a trade interest that is built in already, it's something to look at as a parent, and it's very hands-on. They had employers come in and train them on job interview skills real time. Employers came in and would interview, and you had before that training on how to be interviewed. So in that sense, that was a really wonderful real world thing that our schools were doing that right now probably isn't being done because of COVID. But you're talking about almost doing that in your home now.
Well, and adding to that, let's go back to a kid who has an IEP, regardless of their age. This is where there is some negotiation room in there to say, okay, we want to do this credit and we want to do it this way, and we're willing to meet these standards, and negotiating with that special education team and saying, okay, given the unprecedented circumstances, the new word of 2020, this idea that we're going to do this instead, and can you guys negotiate with us and give us this PE credit or give us this art credit, because we're going to do this instead, and we think it would be better use of our time. So
yeah, thinking creatively and out of the box in those IEP meetings is really important. I know it's good to become familiar with the academic standards, because as our children get older, it's hard to get the socialization that you want to see for your child naturalized. And one of the ways to do that is through your civics curriculum. You can use the civics academic curriculum and say, well, in order for my child to meet your curriculum, you're going to have to inbuild these opportunities. So it's never a waste of time, whether you decide to do the project-based learning that Marlo is suggesting, or just negotiating your IEP to better understand what the academic curriculums are for your children. And then
PE. Yeah, PE. I plug a lot of benchmark standards onto PE. Because if you read the PE standards, they're really, really wide. And so you can a lot of times get a lot of goals tied to
That's
PE.
a good idea.
Even if kids aren't qualifying in reading, writing, math, and sometimes we're getting kids qualified that way just because they're not meeting their PE standards. And that sounds kind of silly, but it's kind of a way to kind of change that.
We got, I think the second year Rachel was in the CTE program, or maybe it was just before she graduated, they started making Algebra 1 a requirement to enter the program. You don't need an Algebra 1 to be a beautician. You don't need Algebra 1 to do many of the things that are needed in trades. So parents are having to figure out how to get around that requirement and where did it come from. And that's a longer story, but it's like you said, it's worth sitting down and taking a closer look at and thinking outside the box and getting your child's needs met.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep.
It's always so much fun to explore what education can look like for our children from so many different facets, and you bring so many facets to the table by virtue of your experience and your real life building of educational systems. So thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely. It was a pleasure. Thank you.